I'm Bronwyn Maddox. I'm Director of the Institute for Government, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to have this discussion on the different economic models that have emerged, not only one of them from government so far, that emerged about the consequences of Brexit, how we might compare them, and really what we might say about which of them seems most likely. We're doing this because we've done a whole series of reports on how you do Brexit, on customs, on immigration, a recent excellent report by the team on trade after Brexit and what the different options are, and some other smaller work on the European Court of Justice and so on. And we were continuing with, indeed, the state of Whitehall and the cost of Brexit and other things coming soon. But we wanted to dig into this because, partly because of the very marked lack of economic modelling or impact assessments or anything of that species from the government, but also because others who've been working on it, whether academics or think tanks, have been working on this, and there is now a range of models out there which we can usefully discuss at this point. So that's what this is about. Delighted to have with me Charles Ries, who's the lead author of the recent Rand Corporation report, After Brexit, Alternate Forms of Brexit and Their Implications for the UK, the European Union and the United States. And he was former ambassador to Greece, is that right?
That is right.
Thanks for joining us. And I've here Professor Alan Winters, many of you will know, who heads up the very prominent UK Trade Policy Observatory at the University of Sussex, where he's Professor of Economics. And we are going to have, I'm in good faith, Liam Halligan, who's a Telegraph columnist and author of Clean Brexit, How to Make a Success of Leaving the EU, which if he successfully manages to get here, I will wave at you. We've not empty-chaired him or anything provocative. I think he's simply held up by the usual combination of transport and so on. But we very much hope to be joined by him. I've asked Charles and Alan to kick off with describing their models, and we will play them to the extent we can against some of the others around, like the Treasury ones that came out before the referendum, and indeed the Mayor of London's one that has recently come out, and other ways of talking about this that we might seize on, and then discuss among us why some say, why each says different things, if you like, and then we'll go to questions. We've already had advance notice there are a lot of questions, so I will leave time for that. With that, Charles, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Tell us about your model.
Absolutely. Well, our study, which is called After Brexit, was internally funded, and it was a joint venture, Rand Europe and Rand US. I'm in the Rand US part, and Hans Pung is, a shout out to him, our president of Rand Europe. We did this after the decision, after the referendum, and we take no position on Brexit itself. But we thought it would be interesting to examine, given the significance of it, all of the possible economic relationships that the UK might have with the EU and the rest of the world afterwards. So the headline you've probably seen is that all of the plausible scenarios, we find the British economy to be worse off. The question really is how much worse off. The so-called no deal or
worse off than now.
Worse off than now. And the no deal scenario the Britain trades with the world on the basis of WTO rules is the worst. So in our modeling, which for policy wonks is a gravity model based on the world import-output output database, just for that, get that out there. We found almost 5% negative growth after 10 years, which amounts to $140 billion of lost growth for the British economy, and that's about 40% of the British expected growth over that decade. We then looked at a FTA-like scenario with the EU. So that's a scenario that is Canada plus or minus, it's hard to tell, and we basically assumed it on the basis of Canada. And we found that was about halfway the difference between that 5%. So it was 3% better than 3 percentage points better than the 5% reduction. So 60% or so better off for Britain than a no-deal scenario, but still not is substantially worse than the present circumstances of full membership. We then looked at a UK-US FTA. So at the time when the President Trump was elected, people were talking about a UK-US FTA might replace the value of an EU relationship, a preferential trade relationship with the EU. We found that there is really no basis for that assumption. The United States, an FTA with the United States would be worse by about 40% than an FTA with the EU. And that's logical because half of Britain's exports go to the EU and only about 20% go to the United States. We then looked at, well, what about a trilateral, it's like a TTIP, a new kind of a TTIP that would be a free trade of the Atlantic, the United States, the EU 27, and the UK. This is the only scenario that was a positive for the UK. It's about 7% better than the FTA, 7 percentage points better than the WTO baseline, or about 2 or 3 percentage points of growth better than continued membership. And that's largely because it's a sum of the FTA with the United States, the FTA with the EU, and then the growth effects of the FTA between the two much larger economies, the United States and the EU 27.
So one of those points, just to be clear, it's assuming a very good free trade agreement with the EU.
It is.
Within that package.
Yes, yes. I mean, our assumption was that it would be the same terms all around, all three. But conceptually, it's kind of the sum of the two plus the growth effects of the three. We then took a look at the various other sort of soft Brexit options, the Norway, the Swiss with no services, and sort of a customs union, Turkey plus, and they all center around about the same, a little bit better for the UK than continued membership they're a little bit better for the UK than a free trade agreement, but not by much. We did a transition a deal where we said, okay, suppose there was a transition period of 5 years of continued membership and then an FTA for 5 years between the UK and the EU. That's a little bit better for the UK than just an FTA because you got 5 years of full membership, but not as good as full membership because you have the investment effects of the uncertainty. We knew that people would say, oh, these guys, what do they know? And so one of the innovations of this particular model is we have an online calculator that allows people to play with key elements of the model. And basically the key elements are that you can play with that make a difference are the non-tariff barriers, assumptions about the non-tariff barriers that happen immediately and then over time. And the over time is an estimate of how much there'll be divergence between the standards and regulatory processes in the UK after Brexit and the rest of the EU. Two other elements of the report that are probably worth mentioning very briefly. We did a chapter on game theory, what insights we might draw from the academic field of game theory for the Brexit negotiating process. And I recommended to you to take a look at, but there are two things that seem to me to be important. One is for the EU 27, the most important objective is to prevent other member states from leaving. And so in that respect, their objective in the game is to make sure that the British are seen to lose. This is not a good situation for the British to be in as the negotiations proceed. Secondly, we took a look at the idea of a strategy where the British might seek to find peripheral countries of the EU that might take its side in specific issues and argue with the core, Germany, France, and the Commission on its behalf. And we thought that that probably would not be a successful strategy because the core always has more to offer those peripheral countries than the UK might. And in the end game, you'll need the core's support in order to get a consensus in favor of whatever the end result is. And then finally, impact on the US. This is something that I don't think other studies have taken a look at. And I mentioned in the presentation of the scenario, we find that economically, an FTA with the UK is not important to the US. It's 0.2% after 10 years. It's in the rounding error territory. It would be sad for us, speaking as a former trade negotiator, to lose the British voice at the EU Council table, which tends to be pragmatic and liberal in economic terms, but it's hard to quantify that. We thought that the biggest American interest in the process was that the risks that Brexit might lead to a broader unraveling of the EU, the rest of the 27, and that would impact our political and security interests, which are very much identified with European integration and the construction of the European Union. That's the reduced Shakespeare version.
Charles, thanks for taking us right through that. And let me just sum up for simplicity about what you're saying. Really, every option that you looked at was worse than now, except for this one that you regard as quite unlikely at this point.
Because of political developments on both sides of the Atlantic related to TTIP, but also the change in the U.S. administration.
Great. And as you took us through that arc, you threw in the gravity modeling there. You want to say just a bit about what that is, because it is one of these terms we're all going to become very familiar with, about what it means in building a trade model and what kind of assumptions you're making.
Right. Well, the gravity model is the basic model that is used in most trade analysis, and it proceeds from the assumption that trade will flow where the barriers are lowest, and also it factors in geography.
It matters if you're close to it.
It matters if you're closer. And so gravity modeling is based on modeling the trade barriers and then having the trade flow run again. And that's what the equations do. And then you look at the output. And compared to, for example, the Lord Mayor's study that was released this morning, it's a different database. We use the World Import-Output database, and we don't attempt to model employment effects.
Well, thanks for that. The reason I push you on it is one of the reasons you get sometimes more optimistic models is if they don't use gravity modeling or don't take proximity into account, something we might come on to.
But to me, it's logical. It's just like taxation policy. So you raise taxes on something, you're going to get less of it. So if you raise barriers to trade, you'll have less of it. And then trade affects the economy.
We'll come on to all those points. Alan, what do you make of this? You've looked at this from a different point of view, which is living standards.
Yes, I mean, we have done some work explicitly on living standards, which, if I may, I'll come to in 2 minutes.
Right, fine.
I would just make a couple of other comments. Charles has outlined his model. The really important thing in all of these models is what you put into them. The really, really critical variable is how many barriers do you think you've got at the moment and how many barriers do you think you're going to have in the future? And that is an area where, for goods, we are reasonably well informed with tariffs. We're not very well informed about trading costs in general, logistics costs. For services, which is a very significant part of the British economy, we are really right in the dark. So I think one of the points, and I don't mean this with any disrespect at all, models come with a very wide range of potential error. And I think that what the RAND study does is it gives us a nice analytical walk through, in a sense, something that is fairly typical of where other people have got, with one exception. So Bronwyn mentioned the Treasury model from, nearly 2 years ago now, and that was exactly the same sort of technique, a gravity model, work out how much trade will fall, and you decide that falling trade is bad for falling GDP, and you calculate it from there. You can get you can specify gravity models in a number of ways, and we won't be terribly surprised to say that in a sense, at nearly every fork in the road, the Treasury of that time leant in one particular direction. They got a bigger number essentially not for any reasons of corruption or mispractice, but just that you have to make a whole pile of judgments. Other people like the National Institute have replicated that number, the LSE as well. It's fairly much sort of where the profession is. The one person who is quite different is Patrick Minford, or the Economist for Free Trade. Bronwyn has mentioned that they don't have geography in their model. They also don't have a distinction between a drug that is made, shall we say, in Nepal and a drug that is made in the US. They're perfect substitutes. And that's really why Patrick is able to be very optimistic. It's all right, we can junk all this stuff from Europe, we can get it at 20% cheaper by buying it from developing countries or the other side of the world. Two things further to say. One is we have now got a little bit of work on what's actually happened rather than predictions. There's been a nice little exercise that's looked at the pattern of GDP over the last 18 months and suggests that the British economy is now a surprisingly interesting number, more or less £350 million a week worse off than it would have been had we not done Brexit. We can talk about the techniques there, but it's sort of based on real numbers. It's also the case that work has been done that has suggested, we all know that we've had inflation, we all know that it's hit living standards. Work at the LSE showed that the goods, services that prices have risen most in over the last year are precisely those ones that are most open to trade. Therefore, really they infer that the exchange rate change that followed within hours of the Brexit decision really was what's been driving the decline in living standards over the last year. What we did in the UK TPO was, back to prediction, we asked what happens if we leave the European Union and we end up imposing tariffs on the goods that we import from Europe. Essentially to ask what happens to consumers and how does that affect consumers. By and large, again, lots of assumptions. Let's not be proud about it. They're always there. We found that on average the prices of goods that we consume, overall, European and other goods, would go up by 2.83%. That's about 40% of the typical family in Britain's consumption basket. The other 60% is services, where we assume no change at all. So a bit over 1% cut as a result of a hard Brexit in the sense of levying tariffs on Europe. It didn't look at any of the other stuff about whether we would lose markets and lose income and so on. It just asked very simply, put a tariff on the border, tick, tick, tick. How does that get to Mrs. Jones in Cardiff and Mrs. Smith in Brighton? And the answer is it's not critical, but it's pretty uncomfortable. I mean, they keep slicing 1% and 2% off my living standards, and in the end it gets to be too much.
Thanks very much for that. Liam, well done. I was wondering what bad jokes about barriers I could make. Describing it, but also thank you. You've avoided me having to summarise your book, which I offered to wave at our audience. There you go.
The big book.
Recent book. Would you, you haven't obviously heard them all right now, both of our other speakers right now, but I think you're familiar with the RAND model and so on, are arguing that really on pretty well every plausible scenario, we're going to be worse off. And Alan's, you've just heard now. Do you want to take us through your view of this?
Sure. Sorry I'm late, everybody. Just got a train from Cambridge, which was half an hour after the train that I was meant to get. Thank you for inviting me here. I guess this is a bit of an away fixture for me, but that's fine. I mean, Gerard Lyons and I wrote a book which is completely designed to be a book that is for everybody. It's not a tribal book. We're not particularly tribal people, though Gerard, of course, has worked in politics for somebody called Boris Johnson. I guess what I'd say is that I think it's unfortunate. I'm not here to throw stones. What I would like to do, away from the political maelstrom, if we can, even if I suffer from a cancelled train, is to try and move the debate, at least for tonight, onto the outcome of our talks rather than the process of our talks. Of course, the daily news cycle is almost entirely dominated by process, the political process, who's up and who's down, and the actual process of the negotiations. There's very little that's said about the outcome, and that's partly the government's fault. I think the government's doing actually a terrible job of selling its vision of Brexit. I think the Prime Minister is wrong she was wrong to reply to Ian Dale the way she replied to Ian Dale. She should be not viewing Brexit as something that I must do because it is my duty. She should be telling the British population why actually there are many advantages, while some disadvantages, to us being outside the single market and the customs union. And I hear very, very little of that. But there's a very respectable case to be made for being outside the single market and being outside the customs union. And in the first half of our book, Jared and I do indeed focus on the negotiations. We wrote the book in basically between June and September 2016, and September 2016. I think most of the footnotes are July and August. A lot of what we've been saying in the book is coming true on the divorce bill and Northern Ireland and so on. But the other half of the book, in fact the final 2/3 of the book, is unashamedly an attempt to try and lay out our model of a post-Brexit Britain. Things you can do outside the single market and the customs union that you can't when you're inside them. I think it's a little bit sad that the last sort of official attempt we had at government forecasting, as opposed to Rand and other academics, or other groups like Economists for Brexit and so on, but the last sort of official forecast we had was the Treasury before the referendum. And of course, I mean, as an economist, it's very difficult to get your head around just how wrong they were. I'm sorry. We were going to have minus 0.6% growth in Q3 of 2016 and minus 0.6% growth we're going to have minus 1% annualised within one quarter in Q3 of 2016 and then minus 0.6% in Q4. We were going to have an immediate and profound economic shock, weren't we, ladies and gentlemen? That's what the Treasury report said, and I read every word and all the footnotes, and some of the assumptions were ridiculous, frankly. The idea that the UK would cut no free trade agreements with anyone else outside the EU. Rand didn't make that grotesque assumption, not least because since the Treasury report, there have indeed been many countries who have shown much interest in cutting free trade deals with the world's 5th or 6th largest economy. And instead of minus 0.1 and minus 0.6 in Q3 and Q4, we got plus 0.6 and plus 0.6, didn't we? We didn't have an immediate and profound economic shock. We didn't have the loss of 500,000 jobs. We've actually had pretty good employment. That's partly been because of an exchange rate devaluation, yes. But if you go back to IMF, December 2015, January 2016, in their economic outlooks, they say the sterling at that point was 20% overvalued. We're now, sterling trade weighted is about 5% off where it was during the first half of 2016. If you take away the run-up just ahead of the referendum, when of course people like me, or certainly journalists and analysts, were saying, of course Leave are going to lose, of course Remain are going to win. And so then we spiked from something like $1.38 to $1.50. But if you look at for the first 6 months, we're about 4 or 5% off that trade weighted. So there hasn't been an enormous exchange rate devaluation, though of course there has been one. And we have of course had many successive months now of strong manufacturing growth. I think there are many, many problems with the British economy, and I bow to nobody in banging on about them, rather frankly actually, in my economics agenda column in the Telegraph. But I don't think the biggest danger facing the British economy is Brexit, frankly. I'd say that outside the single market there are, I question how useful the single market has been for the UK, actually. You know, the US exports an awful lot to the EU, as does China. I know a lot of large companies like the single market, but a lot of small companies don't like the single market. Of course, only about 8% of our companies actually export to the EU, even though all of them have to comply with EU bureaucracy. That's great for the big accounting firms who get huge amounts of money from SMEs who have to comply, but it's not necessarily good all the time for those SMEs. I think the customs union as well is just anachronistic, frankly, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when we leave, there'll be 15% only of the UK, the world economy inside the EU, only 15%. That's quite astonishing. And does it really make sense to sort of build a tariff wall around 15% of the economy with a customs union? A customs union that we disproportionately pay for because we're the only big EU economy that trades a lot more with the rest of the world than we do with the EU. So it's our lower income households who disproportionately pay high tariffs on food, footwear, clothing to protect uncompetitive producers elsewhere in the EU. And of course we have to give 80% of those tariffs to Brussels, so they don't even help us really. You know, people talk about supply chains, but what I've seen, and I've even read about it in some other newspapers, is if you look at manufacturers in the West Midlands now, they're thinking, well, if we do get a trade deal with the US or other non-EU countries, and we can come to the efficacy of the EU's trade deals. I keep hearing there are 64 of them. No one ever says that only 24 of them are ratified and actually working, or that added up they add to less than 10% of the global economy. But if we do get trade deals, and I think we will, with other large economies, the big economies, the major world economies that the EU, after 60 years of trying, has failed to strike trade agreements with, so China, the US, Brazil, India, big countries, then our manufacturers, of course, will have to think of rules of origin. They'll have to make 55% of the components of the cars or whatever it is they're making in the EU, in the UK, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, they'll have to invest in their supply chains, their domestic supply chains, and that's starting to happen. I've talked to 3 or 4 big manufacturers in the Midlands who've said exactly this to me, and yet I don't really feel that's part of the debate. On the single market, yes, for some kinds of businesses it works, but on the other hand, if it's so great, why have our exports to the Eurozone fallen from 60% in 1999 to, well, the Pink Book tells me 43%, but then a footnote in the Pink Book tells me the Rotterdam effect may be 3 to 5% of GDP, so it's 39 to 40%. Let's say 40%, let's be generous. But it's still fallen a lot. And given that, you know, our biggest single country trading partner is the US, given that we do have all these incredible connections around the world, if you've lived in lots of emerging markets like I have, then you'll understand that more than, say, most British politicians and commentators. Given all those things, it strikes me that it makes a lot more sense to strike our own free trade deals. Now, if you look at a big argument is, of course, you don't have the clout negotiating as the UK as you do as the EU, and there's obviously, I mean, that goes without saying, that's definitely a strong argument. But then again, if you look at the way countries like Switzerland and even rather small countries like Chile have managed to strike trade deals, they've done extremely well. They've struck trade deals with large economies, much larger economies than the EU's managed to do, because they're not negotiating as one of 27 or 28 that often have conflicting agendas. And in the trade deals we have struck, British services don't really get much of a look in. And on services, I'd say the gravity models that we tend to use here in Whitehall, or Whitehall tends to use, obviously promote and emphasise geography. All I'd say is that, I mean, even the likes of McKinsey, they're hardly the sort of world leaders in global thought, frankly. Even the likes of McKinsey have been putting out reports for many years now that say the total value of traded digital and service goods is actually much, much greater than the global value of physical traded goods. So if you're a sort of 1950s post-war view of Europe, then I understand why the custom union makes sense. And Jared and I, a lot of our book is actually the history of the European Union, and it's a very loving history in lots of
lots of ways. Yes,
in lots of ways. But we actually think the customs union is an anachronism. We think the single market is of questionable benefit, particularly when you think of the trade that other countries have managed to do with the European Union outside of the single market without the huge annual payments and the other transgressions on sovereignty that I've yet to mention.
Well, thanks very much for that sweep through your argument. I mean, no one's going to disagree with you about the Treasury's short-term projections, partly because the short-term has already happened, and we know it was wrong, but also because of, if you like, the just intense political climate that was around that, and the question of whether Project Fear was distorting that, but it's about the long term.
I don't criticise the economists who work in the Treasury, many of whom I was at university with. What I do criticise is how that phrase, an immediate and profound economic shock, was shoehorned into the report at the last moment, and then repeating as fact across many, many news cycles by the Chancellor of the day.
But Liam, that one's kind of given that was wrong.
Sure.
What really we're arguing about here is whether the Treasury's long-term vision, as expressed then, because we don't have an update on that, whether that is wrong, whether the kind of things that the Rand Corporation have put out are wrong, whether Alan's picture of future living standards is wrong or not. So we've got rival views on this. Charles, what do you make of Liam's sketch of the future?
Well, you weren't here when I laid out our report, but you've presumably seen it. We're agnostic on Brexit itself. That's a decision for the British public to make. And we tried to take an objective look because it's really the largest such thing that has ever been done. And conceptually what it is that you have a pretty seamless single market now between the UK and the EU, common regulatory package, no trade inspection or barriers. And what is going to happen, it depends on which scenario plays out, but what is going to happen is that in one way or another you're going to raise barriers on trade in goods and services with the 27 members of the EU. How much, what timetable, how it plays out will still be to be determined. And that's what we tried to look at. So what would be the impact of raising barriers? Never been done before. We don't know. The world has never seen such a thing. All previous trade negotiations about reducing barriers to foment growth. And so we were kind of looking at that. The fact that you haven't seen impact in the short term, I would think is clear because Britain is still a member of the single market. The City of London still has full access to the financial services markets of Europe, as well as the rest of the world, and nothing much has changed except the exchange rate thus far. I would just like to comment on the Chile FTA, your point that it's easier for Britain to operate by itself rather than as a member of the EU. And I say this because I spent 4 years in Brussels doing US trade to the EU. I spent 4 years here in London as the economic minister, and I spent a number of years negotiating NAFTA myself in the Bush 41 administration. And there's a big difference between Chile negotiating with the United States and the United States negotiating with the EU. And the difference is we have a Chile agreement because the Chileans were obliged to take our model. Basically, we had all the negotiating clout in that negotiation, and we imposed our conditions for an FTA. And for the Chileans, it was a good deal, so they took it. And the benefits of it are as a function of its goodness. If the UK does a trade negotiation with the US presently, it will attract attention in Washington to the fact that the UK has one of the largest surpluses with the US of any developed country trading partner. And that is a big focus for the present administration, and they will want to undertake to reduce it. Also, some of the issues that torpedo the TTIP will arise very quickly. GMOs and other regulatory things, chlorine chicken, all of the things that stimulated opposition to the TTIP will be presented. Finally, we will, in negotiating with the UK, we will look to establish, shall we say, facts that might influence Brussels for future negotiations. One of those might be this something that the EU's policy of protecting geographical indications. This is very unpopular kind of across the board in the US, yet EU policy. And I can't, it's hard to imagine a FTA between the UK and the US that doesn't essentially undermine the GI system. It's also hard to imagine an FTA between the US and the UK that includes financial services. We didn't want to include financial services in the TTIP, and would be even less likely to want to do it with a UK that it's a world power in financial services. So there are a lot of problems with that scenario. I mean, it's perfectly rational.
We don't have a free trade agreement with you now, of course.
Of course.
So
right.
we do pretty well now.
You do, right, very well.
You're our biggest single country trading partner, 20% of our exports.
Very well, so you really don't need freedom from the restrictions of the EU.
But maybe we can do better.
Maybe you could do worse.
Maybe.
Depending on the agreement.
But we don't know, so...
Right, well that's why...
That's why it's a shame all the modelling is just so
for us,
consistently negative.
For us, the analytic... We strove very hard to be objective, and we've put up this calculator that allows people to alter the assumptions. But we thought this was really interesting because such a thing has never happened before. It's a big roll of the dice, and it's important, we thought, to bring some objective economic analysis to this.
Alan, yes.
Let me add to what Charles said on free trade agreements, because I think really the heart of what you're saying, Liam, is don't worry, we can sign these wonderful free trade agreements with other countries in the world and our trade will take off.
I'm not as Panglossian as you suggest.
Okay, well...
It's not all sunlit uplands.
But you're saying...
I'm just saying it's a shame in 60 years we haven't cut a trade deal with maybe our biggest ally in the world.
And you're saying one other thing as well, aren't you? That geography matters less than some of these models, these gravity models assume right from the beginning.
But let me add sort of two wrinkles to what Charles said. First, I think I don't agree with you that the single market is not worth very much. The single market is worth a huge amount of, in a sense, not having to worry about all the bureaucracy involved in international trade.
For goods.
For goods, but also for services.
Well, it's very patchy for services.
It is patchy, but that's the point. It is patchy.
What did the European Court of Auditors report 2007? Deeply disappointing.
Of course.
Despite endless attempts by the Brits, the Scandinavians to change that.
Just because the single market is not complete, it doesn't mean to say that the single market doesn't add anything. And it certainly does not mean that you can go off and get the same things in the as we have in the single market with our closest neighbour, with everybody else. But the point I really want to make is free trade agreements which just change taxes, just change tariffs, are basically economic distortions. They are not very good ways of generating welfare. What generates welfare is getting down the real costs of international trade. The time I have to spend worrying about stuff, the risk that they'll stop the stuff at the border, the stuff that they won't recognise my degree so I can't give a lecture in Belgium or what have you. All of that stuff requires very deep integration, and it cannot be done without tying your hands. You have to agree with the other party that you will indeed converge on some set of regulations, like accepting chlorinated chicken, or accepting, say, that master's degrees have to be 2 years rather than 1. And the minute you do that, you are exactly back in the same worry about sovereignty that we have the concern about the single market. The important thing about trade is the real cost of doing trade, and you cannot reduce those significantly like we have done in Europe without a constraint, without without having equivalence or some such thing on regulation. If you want to go off and do it with other countries, one, you can sign up with the US, but that will make it more difficult to sign up with other countries because regulations can't pick and choose. You have a regulation, it suits one partner, not the other. But the second is any serious attempt to get deep integration with another country will constrain us. It's out of the frying pan into the fire, but it's a fire that's a lot less close, a lot less rich, and probably a lot less manageable.
But given that
services are so important to us, I don't think you can just wave away the fact that this huge edifice that costs us an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of sovereignty, as well as our sovereignty on things that have nothing to do with exports in the minds of most British voters, not least like borders and other forms of taxation. I don't think you can just wave away the fact that despite huge efforts by many people in this room, I'm sure, certainly many people in this postcode, to make the single market, work for services, we're not really getting anywhere on that. So that's one point I'd make. I don't think you can just dismiss that. We've tried really hard for a long time to make it work with a service superpower, certainly of the region, if not potentially of the world. I don't think that's an exaggeration, at least for the next generation or so. And the other thing I'd say is, yes, of course we want as hassle-free trade as we possibly can, but I'd come back again to the rest of the world. Many other countries have increased their exports from quite a high base to the EU at a much faster pace than we have since we joined the common market, which then of course became the single market. And the States exports $250 billion worth of exports to the EU every year without giving up what we give up. So let not the best be the enemy of the good, given that there are many, many other considerations in this conundrum.
Well, on that note, I mean, for you, how bad is no deal?
Well, I went to see Roberto Azevedo the other day. He told me, it was a little feather in my cap, I thought, I'm the only journalist in the world to have interviewed the last 5 Directors Generals of the WTO. The second one I did was when I met you in Seattle in 1999. Do you remember that? On the streets of Seattle, there was Bronwyn in a gas mask. Yeah. It's not often you get an economist or a Times correspondent in a
I did not have a gas mask.
In their gas mask.
I did not have a gas mask. I caught you out on at least one fact earlier. There was tear gas.
I was going to lend you mine. No, so I went to see Azevedo, and he said a lot of interesting things, and I wrote them up in the Telegraph, and I put them out in a podcast and so on. The whole interview. No one's properly interviewed him since certainly since Article 50, and I said to him, "What do you think of no deal?" And this is
for who?
For the UK, yeah. For the UK with the EU. And he said, well, you already do over half your trade, or around half your trade, he corrected himself, under WTO rules. And yes, I can put that on Twitter and people will attack me and say I don't understand. And of course there are MRAs and all other sub-free trade agreements. But the head of the WTO said, well, you already do around half your trade under WTO rules, and that's fine. And he said, quote, I really don't think it's the end of the world for the UK. Yeah. And I said to him, of course, it would be better if we did have a deal, a proper free trade agreement with the European Union, though I understand it can't be as good as the single market. But it strikes me that we should at least prepare for no deal, because otherwise you go into the negotiation completely naked. And he totally agreed with all that, and you can listen to it on the podcast. That's what he said. So the other thing to say is, if we don't have no deal as an option, many of the things we need to do if we have a deal, we need under no deal anyway. We need to expand our customs facilities anyway. There's lots of things that are not exclusive just to the no deal scenarios, so we should be doing them. But we need to prepare for the fact. We need to stop saying things like crashing out of the WTO with no deal, given that we do trade with the US and many other countries around the world outside of a free trade agreement under WTO rules. Of course, if you go from the single market relationship to WTO rules with the EU, there will be costs, there will be hassle, and there will be lots of work to be done. I totally accept that. But I don't think as an end result it's a disaster based on what we see around the rest of the world.
Let me ask
and the head of the WTO agrees with me.
Alan.
Well,
who doesn't?
No, I do agree. Right. It seems to be extraordinary that we have an argument when you tell me
Brexit is not the worst problem that the British economy is facing. We all agree. Does that mean to say Brexit is nothing to worry about, given that we could do something about it? No, it doesn't.
I agree.
Given that other countries, and we overcome trade costs in some places, therefore we don't need to worry about trade costs in Europe, does it follow? It doesn't follow. This is the point. We can't just say, look, because it's not a disaster, don't worry, let's do it, what the hell? We need to have a positive...
me as an absolutist, and I'm not.
We need to have...
trade-offs, some shades of grey.
Absolutely. But anyway, the point is, it seems to me, the fact that it is not going to be a disaster is something that I think Charles also will agree.
Yeah.
5% off GDP is a bit of a pain in the backside. It is not existential.
Well,
but there's no reason for that reason just to do it willy-nilly. I actually ought to worry.
What time frame would it be 5% off GDP?
10 years.
Okay, so totally, just let me work this out. Total exports to the EU about 10% of GDP last time I checked. Let's say an average tariff of 2% that goes on. I mean,
well,
really
the non-tariff barriers are more important, as Alan said, than the tariff barriers, because the delays of the lorries, the meeting of paperwork, and other inspection requirements.
Has the performance of the British economy since our Brexit vote surprised either of you? Has it caused you to change your modelling assumptions or think about the problem in a different way? Has the spike in FDI in Q4 of 2016 caused you to...
The German economy's performed, what, twice as well as the UK
Germany has
economy?
a massively undervalued exchange rate because it's in a Eurozone with loads of other countries that have 40% youth unemployment.
Well, we didn't try and model the short term. Brexit hasn't happened. Brexit will happen.
But everyone knows it's going to happen, and we've still had lots of FDI. We haven't had lots of lobbyists from banks moving to Frankfurt, even though they said they would. Goldman Sachs' global European headquarters is still in Farringdon the last time I checked. Nobody really serious is saying that the Oliver Wyman numbers of 75,000 financial service sector jobs from the city after Brexit are true. Most people are talking more like 5,000 to 7,000, a tenth.
But the point that Brexit hasn't happened.
Everyone knows it's going to happen.
But we don't know what form it's going to happen in, which is why you might get some of these bodies, reacting in a different way, months or a couple of years down the line.
So the two parties, I mean, away from the Westminster bubble, the two parties, the Scots Nats and the Lib Dems, who campaigned for a second referendum in the 27th, well, the Lib Dems got the worst result in their modern history, and the Scots Nats lost 30% of their seats. So they didn't do particularly well. So therefore, do we really think that the UK is going to stay in the single market? Do the people that are investing heavily in the UK really think that we're going to stay in the single market? I don't think they do. I think they think that we are going to leave the single market and the customs union. Because since Lancaster House, that's been the stated position of the British government. The Labour Party's completely split. It won't even say what it means or what it thinks.
That's what our study looks at, is leaving.
So I would say that people are still investing in the UK and people saying, actually, we're not going to leave, and do think that we are going to leave the single market and do think we are going to leave the customs union.
So you're saying that the bulk of opinion among the people who count is actually there really is nothing to worry about?
No, you keep saying that I think there's nothing to worry about. I think on balance, okay, on balance, I think it makes more sense for our long-term economic prosperity if we are outside a single market that doesn't allow us to cut our own regulation, which stymies our ability to do free trade deals around the world.
I understand what you think, Liam.
And I think we should be outside the customs union, which is not only an anachronism, but is also a grotesque affront to people living in many other countries where it causes a huge amount of poverty.
Look, I'm tempted to let this run, but I think we're going to, because it is illuminating in many ways. But let's have some questions, because we're going to come straight back over lots of these points as well. Over here on the side, I'll take two at a time.
Hello, I just thought I should...
Would you like to say who you are, please?
I should say, so my name's Alex Conway. I work at the Greater London Authority, and I'm the senior official with responsibility for Brexit-related issues. So we've had a busy day or two with the reports, which from Cambridge Econometrics, which hopefully you've all seen.
Couldn't miss them.
No, we're pleased with the splash that it made. The headline message, for those of you who hadn't seen it, I suppose I'd characterise as the harder the Brexit, the worse the economic outcome, and that the UK outside London overall is affected worse than London, according to the models that the economists used. I suppose I was wondering if there was might be a unifying thought actually between all the sort of very interesting things that you said today, which was around the what the government might be doing, because I think the Mayor's been very clear that one of the reasons he's doing this is because the government isn't doing anything, and so while I don't think, and I'm not an economist by background myself, but we've asked some economists to take a look at some scenarios, and they've provided some scenarios. People who know more about these things than me may be able to pick holes in some of those scenarios, but at least it starts a discussion, hopefully, around how we might have a more sort of sensible conversation around Brexit, which may indeed include, is there a certain amount of pain that overall people are prepared to take economically? That might be something that people are comfortable with, but it doesn't feel like we're there at the moment. So I suppose the hope is that this might encourage a bit more thinking from government and others to sort of respond, so we can have more of a dialogue in the future.
Thanks for explaining that. All right, here on the aisle.
Yes, John Peet, I'm from The Economist. I'd like really to hear whether Liam's got any evidence for thinking that services exports will be freed up with countries like China, Brazil, India, and the United States. I mean, as you said, it's been difficult in the single market. We're a member of the single market. There is a services directive in force in the single market. And all the evidence, I think, that the other two have come up with is that countries like the US are not going to welcome free services exports from the UK. India has made very clear that if we want to open up their market, we need to give Indians more visas. Where's the sort of evidence that there could be a services boom with any of these other countries that we haven't had with the rest of the European Union?
Well, of course, I think, and I covered this with the Director General again. Maybe you can listen to the interview, John. I still think that the WTO, in some ways, is still labours under the shadow of its predecessor organisation that was, of course, largely about goods trade and so on. And I think there is, once you get beyond all the chest beating and rhetoric and pre-deal, fronting up to each other, I think there is an appetite for freer trade in services among the world's leading service sector exporters, which of course we are one, and which the States is one. And who knows, there may be, it may be that we can work with the US within the WTO. I don't think that's pie in the sky, and other countries to try and make services a much bigger part of what the WTO tries to do, and tries to make global, I think one reason why the multilateral system's broken down really, and of course for all our labouring at Doha, Seattle, Bronwyn, the Doha round, I was there as well. The Doha round, of course, didn't happen. The first real failure of a multilateral trade negotiation since the 30s. It's quite, and the other big agreements we've had since then, and most recently the Bali Agreement, really gets around that problem by being a lot less ambitious. It may be that I don't think it's jingoistic to say that a big service sector exporter like us can work with the States to try and export more services. And it's impossible to do services when the UK and the EU, because of course no one will touch agriculture because it's gold-plated. And that makes it very, very difficult to do services deals with the kind of countries that could benefit and want British services, because we can't give them anything on agriculture because we're tied to the hip to the French and the Belgians. I think that's a major dynamic, the sort of agriculture for services deal in a environment where a big country like the UK is coming back to the WTO, and other countries can rally around, other service providers, to try and make services a big part of global trade negotiations rather than just coal and widgets.
Just a question. I mean, I'm not sure. Are you proposing that freed from the EU, the UK would be able to engage in bilateral or plurilateral free trade agreements all over the world and utilize and get this better services access? Or are you suggesting that freed from the EU, the UK would work with the US to revitalize the WTO multilateral process where any benefits are available to everyone?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I do have doubts about whether the multilateral model can survive in its kind of, post-war form. And I think many people who are close observers of the WTO, I don't think we can pin our hopes on a big multilateral deal because I think it's very, very difficult. The world is a lot less unipolar than it was in 1944.
Right. Well, but
there are many poles.
But
I do think services should be a major part of global free trade agreements, and at the moment they're often not.
That is correct.
And the deals that some EFTA and EEA countries have done outside the EU, again taking on my Twitter adversaries, have generally not included services.
One of the problems with services arrangements that was raised already is the fact that for developing countries, doing a services deal often involves immigration. The idea of delivering services by people showing up and doing it in your country has proven to be quite unpopular, and it would seem to me that in the circumstances here, in which migration is a big issue in the UK and the EU in general, it's pretty tough to negotiate a big services opening with countries that want to thereby free up temporary workers and other kinds of controversial circumstances for delivering the services that they're competitive in.
Well, there's a chapter in my book with Jared on immigration, but just a few points. So I'm the son of an immigrant, and I grew up in an immigrant culture, very much so, an immigrant community, very, very diverse. I don't actually think the problem with the sevenfold expansion that we had in net annual immigration in this country from 1997 to 2016, from 50,000 under Blair 97 to 352,000 net in 2016. I don't actually think the problem was the final number. I think the problem was the ramp up, the pace, and I think an even bigger part of the problem than the pace, because the British public are generally very, very tolerant, in my experience as the son of an immigrant. The problem was that it was almost as if we were not only not allowed to talk about it, very little provision was made for it in terms of it coincided, I don't know if you've noticed, with the slowest pace of annual house building in this country since the general strike of 1926. And I still think we have to we need to strive for much, much greater efficiencies in our public services and even put a bigger share, whisper it, of our GDP into our public services in order, I think something like 2% of the UK landmass it has construction on it, and something like 4% is urban in any sense whatsoever. It's not as if we can't take more people, we can, and I think we will. But I don't think you can take more people when you do it so quickly and with so little, and the political class plays so little regard to the impact this is having on the vast bulk of the population outside the M25. I mean, that was why everyone in this room, I'm sure, was so shocked by Brexit, except maybe those of us who live outside the M25. So I think it can be done.
Let's take some more questions. Here in the front, and then back. I'll take two together, and then I'll come to another two.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. I have a lot of interviews with Japanese companies, and they don't know where you are going, and so that's a big problem for Japanese companies. So they don't care Brexit because even you do a Brexit, UK economy has some strength, but they don't know where you are going. And please tell us where is your goal? And so goal post is so David Davis says Canada plus, and Barnier said Canada plus. What is goal post, and what is the implication of Canada plus and triple plus?
this is not the right panel to tell you what the government intends. Finally,
I don't know.
Finally, to say, you can say what you. We bring in another one, and we can answer these two together over here.
Thank you, Carol Walker. I just wondered what all of you think of how viable this idea of Theresa May's of having essentially a series of different sectoral deals. This idea that you have 3 baskets with varying degrees of convergence and access and tariffs. And I know at the moment clearly the EU are saying no, that's having your cake and eating it. But whether you think that when push comes to shove, it is viable to think that we could have different sectoral deals which would suit different sectors of the economy, and whether that might end up being a way out of the some of the wider arguments that we're hearing about.
Great, thank you for bringing it up. An idea that astonishingly resembles an IFG paper some weeks before that, though it has proved more popular in London than Brussels. We've got 2 questions there. One, where is the government likely to end up? And one about the 3 baskets, and they're both related. Who wants to go in? Predicting the government is probably harder than predicting the economy.
I'll take the second rather than the first. I'm a foreigner, so I wouldn't try to speak. The problem with the sectoral deal from international trade law standpoint is that it would violate Article 24 of the WTO and the GATT before it. Free trade agreements that abolish tariffs are, in theory, supposed to be comprehensive, covering all trade. And that was, in the Uruguay round, that the disciplines with that respect were actually increased. So that's the number one problem, is it's violative of international law. And we saw when the UK and the EU announced or notified the WTO that they had some ideas for distributing the tariff rate quotas that also resulted from the Uruguay round, and they thought they'd kind of divide them up and everyone would go along with it. Many countries, including the United States, objected. So if there were such a sectoral deal, it would cause problems in international legal terms. And the other thing is, it's hard, having just come myself from Brussels, it's hard to imagine the EU itself agreeing to something that was so clearly cherry picking in nature. But who knows?
I need to disagree with Charles a little bit. I think the proposal is about regulation, not about tariffs.
Oh, well, in that case, then it doesn't.
I don't think anyone is particularly running a view that we have selective tariff reductions.
Oh, okay.
So essentially, one can meet Article 24 in its simple, sort of plain vanilla form that we actually apply by having 0 tariffs with the EU. I think the proposal, I know more about Bronwyn's than Mrs. May's, I have to say, but the proposal really was, there's a set of things where we agree we will have convergence of regulation, a set of things where we'll be totally free to go wherever we want, things that don't matter perhaps, I don't know, and a set of things in the middle that somehow we sort of negotiate and cooperate over. It's not an unattractive idea. But setting these things into baskets is always very contentious. I've had big arguments in the past about why cement is not a consumer good in developing countries, and therefore why they can't charge 25% tariffs on it. It's going to be a nightmare sort of settling the list. But also the point is, goes back in a sense to what I was saying to Liam, one of the huge virtues of the single market is it's stripped away not just tariffs between European countries, but all border regulations altogether. If we get into a situation where even one, at least in principle, where even one good potentially could have serious differences in standards between the UK and the EU, we need to stop, in principle, just about everything crossing the border in case that good happens to be in the lorry. It's not as extreme as that, but the point is this 3 regulatory packages does not get around the fact that the only way you can entirely abolish border restrictions is for goods to have complete equivalence or harmonisation. Say we don't worry about differences if there are any. So I think it's practically very difficult, but it also doesn't solve what I think to many people is the real problem. You might be able to do it in services, have different blocks, But then, in a sense, it's all going to be so ad hoc that you might as well do services sector by sector if we are going to go through a sort of free trade agreement plus. What's the government going to do? I don't know. I mean, who knows? They certainly don't tell me. But it's very difficult to tell. You have to say it's quite strange that the Cabinet had its first discussion only last month, and that was really just a sort of formality. It's among the most distressing things, it seems to me, about Brexit is just how little anyone in positions of responsibility has thought to think this thing through in a careful way. It's why Liam had to write his book, why I guess I'm involved. And we're not out of that wood yet. They still are not really able to confront the differences in concept that they have and move to the stage of working out the details of a technical solution. So, like you, we're all waiting with bated breath.
Briefly, because maybe you want to get some more questions in, Bronwyn. I think sort of intersectoral deals are a good sort of way to think about the thing in the first place, but they do lead to difficulties, as we've heard. Gerard and I wrote a paper in December 2016, so before Lancaster House, that advocated intersectoral deals as a starting point and a 2-year transition period. So we're not by any means absolutists about this. I think there are many benefits to a transition period. So we only have one kind of shift, if you know what I mean. I actually, with regret, think the most likely outcome is no deal. Not for ideological reasons. I'm not ideological about it, just for practical reasons. I just don't think the politicians understand how difficult this stuff is. So I think we absolutely have to prepare for no deal, because that will probably be the most likely outcome. It won't be a decision we make, it will just be what happens, frankly. It must be very difficult from Japan. I don't think the international press, with all respect to friends and former colleagues in the room, gives you all the nuances about what's actually happening. I think also the German election has made things much more complicated. I think in the end, I hope in the end, that elected politicians will do a lot of the heavy lifting, the sort of political head-to-head that has to happen in this, because there are of course massive vested interests involved. We mustn't be naive. But the fact that Angela Merkel lost her ability to form a government, let me put it like that at this point, the fact that the SPD and the CDU between them, for the first time since the Second World War, didn't command 50% of the German votes cast, and the fact that AfD, a egregious party in my view, got 13% of the vote, the first hard right party to enter the Bundesrat since the Second World War. These are big changes in Germany. And it means that Mrs. Merkel, who I desperately want to remain as German Chancellor, hasn't been able to focus to any degree on Brexit. She's got enough problems of her own. I think if she did, as and when she does, or as and when elected leaders do, there are, of course, many powerful commercial lobbies across the Eurozone and the broader EU that actually want trade with the EU the UK to carry on as near as it possibly can to the way it is now, because they benefit enormously from it. I think it's like 70 to 80 billion euros, the latest number I saw, the surplus. EU surplus.
Liam, thanks. No, all interesting. But we still got loads of hands up. One here on the aisle. Was there one in the doorway? Someone boldly came.
Thank you very much. Tony Hutton, one-time Director General Trade Policy in the DTI. I was also at Seattle, though spent most of my time in EU coordination rather than on the streets. It seems to me that one of the problems we've got is there is an unequal argument here. We can more or less chart what the short and long-term costs are of leaving the EU on certain assumptions. They're not easy themselves. What is much more difficult is the question of what the benefits will be to offset any damage which is done. Now, one thing we can be quite clear about, I can be quite clear about anyway, is that doing trade deals, which is a term unknown to the WTO until this point, is not a straightforward thing. People understandably want things back from you. Ambassador Ries and I spent quite a lot of our time actually arguing about what we might do for each other and never coming to any very great conclusion about it. Similarly, the Indians have made it quite clear that they are very reluctant to liberalize. They always have been reluctant to liberalize. It's built into their DNA. But not only that, they also want concessions on immigration. The Chinese would almost certainly want an assurance, for example, we would not use trade policy instruments like anti-dumping and countervailing duty against subsidized imports. Now, assuming we can make all those, there is still a timescale problem. And the question which I want to pose is, to what extent have people in building up these models of, as it were, the damage, been able to make any assumptions whatsoever about the generative effect of leaving and the ability to make trade deals? And to what extent can they take into account the timetable? Because one thing is pretty clear. If we leave, the damage will be the short term, the benefits will be very long term if the history of trade negotiations has any relevance in this particular area.
Thanks for making that point. The IFG has argued that the first thing that the EU should, that the UK should do is try and replicate the free trade agreements that it would lose, like South Korea and so on, because those are immediate losses. And as you point out, the free trade agreements in the future are of unknown benefit and take some time. There's one over here, and I'm going to try and squeeze one more in, which is over there. And everyone's going to have to give really brief answers to these complex things.
I'm Patience Wheatcroft, and I'm unashamedly continuing to campaign for Remain, it seems, along with the will of about 52% of the people. Put that to one side, because Liam and I have done battle on this regularly. I'd be very interested to know what Alan and Charles put into their models to take account of what's likely to be a constant flow of labour, immigrant labour, out of this country, and also how you cope with whatever is going to be the Northern Ireland situation with a non-border or goodness knows what. And then, if I could, I'd like to ask Liam, who doesn't really have a model, a different question, which is, if what you say is right about the single market producing really no benefit, why is it that 132,000 companies from this country only export to the single market?
Okay, thank you. And squeeze in one last one here. And these are going to have to, I'm afraid, be brief last thoughts.
Hello, Ivana Dimitrova from Grant Thornton. One of the LSE studies you mentioned shows that Brexit would have a differential impact on regional economies, meaning that different regions have different interests economically. And would a comprehensive trade deal reflect those regional differences? And should regions be free to approach and negotiate with the EU directly?
Great question. Okay, let's go. And these are going to have to be really brief, and don't feel obliged to answer them all. Liam, do you want to answer that one that was directed to you from Patience?
Yeah, just briefly, I totally agree that we need to try and roll over our deals that we have with the EU. As of though, actually, the phrase he used was, it's a good head start if you have an existing deal as a member of the EU with a country like South Korea and South Africa and Mexico and the other large economies that the EU has managed to do a free trade deal with. Actually, Jared and I, we're both trained econometricians. We did a lot of modelling for our book. We've also been involved, some people can model and write columns as well. We also have done some work on the economists for free trade models. The trouble we've got, though, is the trouble the panel has identified, and one of the questions identified. The modelling is done by sort of entrenched camps, isn't it? You have modelling done in Whitehall that is often has a sort of political overseer that wants a certain result and assumes that the UK won't cut any free trade deals ever with anyone outside the EU. Then you have modelling done by the likes of economists for free trade who think that we'll remove all tariffs and everyone will want to do trade deals with us straight away. And that's the problem, really. That's why we've got to get over, I think, this notion that we're not going to leave. We've got to stop fighting the referendum, with all respect. We've got to think about the damage it would do to our democracy if we do try and refight the referendum.
And the political classes and the broader intelligentsia and even the economists, to the extent that they're part of those two groups, have to get together and try and come up with some models that, with the assumptions of which don't offend the other side. Because
okay. But Liam Patience's point, apart from the swipe, whether or not you've got a model, was about your assertions about the single market being of no benefit. Let's just pick up that one.
I didn't say for a second it would be no benefit. I just question its relative benefit compared to its costs in terms of sovereignty, the thick end of 10 billion net a year, every year, forever, and that will only go up. And all the other costs, given that other leading economies export quite happily to the EU, and their growth in those exports has been much greater than ours, both in absolute and percentage terms.
Liam, thanks for that. Alan?
There were two sets of modelling questions from Tony. I mean, has anyone done anything on the FTAs? Charles could say, but I don't think anyone has seriously looked at the timing. In a sense, just because it's even more uncertain than the rest. No one's going to sign serious trade deals with us before we've settled with Europe. We don't know when we'll have settled with Europe. And so, in a sense, it's all up in the air. I think it is also the case that very few patients have wanted to risk putting migration into their trade models, essentially because it's so unknown and so contentious that it's what people would talk about rather than the trade bits. And in terms of macroeconomics, Northern Ireland is sufficiently small, it doesn't affect the macroeconomics very much. That is not to say it doesn't matter. It matters absolutely critically. It might turn out to be what defines the deal. However, it's not macroeconomically really critical. On the regional effects, Ivana, exactly right. The regions very much differ. I mean, we've said this quite a long time ago, and other people are saying it now. What's the answer? The answer is absolutely not to have different regions going off and negotiating themselves with the EU, because that means you'll have to put borders up between the United Kingdom's regions. The answer is we need some sort of decent sort of conversation in Britain, some consultative mechanism, maybe formally written into the trade bill or what have you, but essentially we've got to start having the conversation that the Cabinet cannot yet bring itself to have.
I agree with that.
And that's where we thrash out the question about what are we going to do about the concentration, the sales of services. We have something called services provided by primary industry. It's almost all salmon fishing in Scotland, as far as I can tell. That's a really big interest. If we're going to ignore that, we need to be answerable, in a sense, to the Scots. But absolutely not parallel negotiations. Please, please.
Can I?
I'm promising, Charles, we're already over time. Really sadly, this could obviously go on for a long time. Charles.
Very quickly, our estimates, we did the FTA with the US as a proxy for other FTAs because we are the biggest, as Liam pointed out. We assumed in our modeling that the FTA with the US went into effect in 2019 when the UK leaves the EU. Obviously ridiculous assumption, but from the standpoint of making all of the numbers based on the same GDP base, that made sense. And these are abstract things. We had no preconception. We tried to cover all of the possible after Brexit scenarios. We don't have a political axe to grind, particularly, and that was what we thought our contributions were. One other thing is that in the calculator, the online calculator that I mentioned, there are two kinds of NTBs you can vary. One of them is the NTBs that enter into force at the moment in which the FTA enters into force. This is the rules of origin and so forth. And the other is NTBs over time, and that's a proxy for regulatory divergence. And if you think it's going to be large, you can actually take our assumptions and expand them and see what the effects are in GDP. If you think they're not going to happen at all, you can take them to zero and see what the effects are in GDP. We thought that was a contribution. We didn't model, Tony, the effects of labor shortages that might arise from EU citizens leaving. On Ireland, what I say is obviously it's not important in macro sense. The situation in in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, relates directly to what kind of trade arrangements you're going to come up with. The best solution for Ireland is a customs union, but that's the worst solution for Liam's vision of a global Britain.
Yeah. Okay, and just and the point about, but when do you take in these free trade agreements in the model?
Well, we assume, so that really each of the scenarios were on the same base, we assume that each of the scenarios begins in 2019 and goes for 10 years. But there is a transition scenario, and that scenario is you got 5 years as full single market member and then 5 years in an FTA with the EU. And that's slightly better than the FTA with the EU by itself because single market has lower barriers. But we do in the text talk about Canada and all these other, Korea and so forth, and the process that would start. And we couldn't model all of them, we just thought the US was the most important.
Thanks. We clearly could go on a long time. In fact, I can say, look, to be continued. We called this event because of the astonishing lack of economic discussion in the 18 months since the referendum, and in fact put it together on the day of David Davis's equally astonishing performance in the Commons about the impact assessments that did or did not exist. We will come back to these questions. Thank you for these terrific questions today. Thank you very much for our panellists. Not least, no apologies. Thank you for making the effort to get here despite the obstacles you face. Thank you very much indeed.